It was a quiet Tuesday evening when the unthinkable happened. A routine traffic stop turned into a nightmare for 28-year-old Keisha Johnson, a single mother and small business owner from Atlanta. The flashing lights of the police cruiser lit up her rearview mirror, and her heart sank. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. She'd been driving under the speed limit. Her registration was up to date, and her car was in perfect condition. But as the officer approached her window, his demeanor was anything but routine. His voice was cold, his questions pointed, and his eyes scanned her car like he was searching for something. Keisha's stomach churned as he ordered her out of the vehicle. What happened next would change her life forever and expose a web of corruption that reached far beyond the streets of her neighborhood. As Keisha stood on the side of the road, hands trembling, the officer began searching her car. She watched in disbelief as he pulled a small bag of white powder from under her seat, a bag she had never seen before. "This isn't mine," she protested, her voice shaking. But the officer didn't listen. He slapped handcuffs on her wrists and read her rights. Keisha's mind raced. How did that get there? Who would do this to her? She had no criminal record, no enemies that she knew of. But as she sat in the back of the squad car, tears streaming down her face, she realized something far more sinister. Was it play? This wasn't just a mistake. This was a setup. The news of Keisha's arrest spread quickly through her community. Friends and family were outraged, but no one knew how to help. The evidence against her seemed airtight, and the police weren't budging. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, an unexpected ally stepped forward. A man whose name sent shockwaves through the department. His name was Marcus Carter, and he wasn't just any ordinary citizen. He was the chief of the CIA's Atlanta field office, a man with a reputation for being unshakable, uncompromising, and fiercely protective of justice. When he caught wind of Keisha's case, something didn't sit right with him. He'd seen enough corruption in his career to know when something smelled fishy. And this reeked. Marcus didn't know Keisha personally, but he knew the system, and he knew how easily it could be manipulated. He started digging, pulling strings, and calling in favors. What he uncovered was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The officers involved in Keisha's arrest had a history of misconduct, and the evidence against her, it didn't add up. The bag of powder had no fingerprints, no trace of Keisha's DNA. It was as if it had been planted there by someone who wanted her out of the way. But why? What did Keisha know, or what had she seen that made her a target? As Marcus delved deeper, he found himself facing resistance at every turn. Internal affairs stonewalled him. The officers involved clammed. Even his own colleagues warned him to back off, telling him it wasn't worth the risk. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man who backed down. He'd spent his entire career fighting for the truth, and he wasn't about to stop now. He arranged a meeting with Keisha, hoping to piece together the puzzle. What she told him left him speechless. It wasn't just about her. It was bigger than her. There was a pattern here, a system designed to silence those who dared to speak out. And Keisha? She was just the latest victim. But as Marcus and Keisha began to unravel the truth, they realized they weren't the only ones watching. Someone was following them, shadowing their every move. Anonymous threats started pouring in, warning them to drop the case. Marcus's office was broken into, his files stolen. Keisha's home was vandalized, her car tires slashed. It was clear they were getting too close to something, or someone, powerful. But who? And what were they hiding? The tension reached a boiling point one fateful night when Marcus received a cryptic phone call. The voice on the other end was distorted, but the message was clear. Back off, or you'll regret it. Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing. He knew the risks, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. Not when so much was at stake. He turned to Keisha, who sat across from him, her eyes filled with fear and determination. "We're close," he said, his voice steady. "But we're not safe. Not yet." And then, just as they thought they had a breakthrough, the unthinkable happened. A key witness vanished without a trace. The evidence they'd been counting on, gone. It was as if someone was always one step ahead, always watching, always waiting. Marcus and Keisha were left with more questions than answers, and time was running out. The trial was just days away, and without the evidence they needed, Keisha's future hung in the balance. But Marcus wasn't ready to give up. He had one last card to play, a move so risky it could cost him everything. But if it worked, it could expose the truth and bring down the people responsible. As the sun set on the city, casting long shadows over the streets, Marcus and Keisha sat in silence, the weight of their mission heavy on their shoulders. They knew the next 24 hours would change everything, but they also knew they were walking into the lion's den. The question wasn't just whether they could prove Keisha's innocence. It was whether they could survive long enough to tell the story. And as the clock ticked down, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for their lives. Keisha's life hadn't always been this chaotic. Just a few months ago, she was running her own hair salon, a small but thriving business she'd built from the ground up. It was more than just a job to her. It was a safe space, a place where women in her community could come to feel beautiful, empowered, and heard. Keisha had always been a fighter ever since she was a little girl growing up in a rough part of town. She'd worked 2 jobs to put herself through cosmetology school, and she'd poured every ounce of her energy into making her dream a reality. But now, sitting in Marcus's dimly lit office, she felt like that dream was slipping through her fingers. The salon had been closed since her arrest, and the thought of losing everything she'd worked for was almost too much to bear. Marcus could see the weight of it all in her eyes. He leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Keisha, I need you to think hard. Is there anything at all that might explain why someone would want to frame you? Did you see something? Hear something? Even if it seemed small at the time, it could be important." Keisha frowned, her mind racing. She'd been over this 100 times in her head, but nothing stood out. She was just a hairstylist, not some whistleblower or activist. She paid her taxes, minded her own business, and stayed out of trouble. But then something clicked. A memory she hadn't thought about in weeks. "There was this one guy," she said slowly, her brow furrowing. "He came into the salon a few weeks ago. Didn't want a haircut or anything, just sat in the waiting area flipping through magazines. He was there for almost an hour, just watching people come and go. I thought it was weird, but I didn't say anything. He didn't seem, dangerous or anything, just off." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Did you get a name? A description?" Keisha shook her head. "No, but I remember what he looked like. Tall, white, mid-40s maybe. He had this tattoo on his wrist. Some kind of symbol. I didn't recognize it, but it looked military or something." Marcus scribbled notes furiously, his mind already piecing together possibilities. A stranger lurking in her salon, watching her. It was too much of a coincidence. But before he could press further, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number, just 2 words. "Stop digging." Marcus showed it to Keisha, and her face paled. "They're watching us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, and they're scared. That means we're on the right track." But the question remained. Who were they? And what were they so desperate to hide? As the night wore on, Marcus decided to dig into the officers involved in Keisha's arrest. He started with Officer Daniels, the one who'd pulled her over. A quick search revealed a string of complaints against him. Excessive force, racial profiling, even accusations of evidence tampering. But every time an investigation was opened, it was mysteriously closed soon after. Marcus's gut told him there was more to this guy than met the eye. He was just a pawn in a much bigger game. But who was pulling the strings? Meanwhile, Keisha's mind kept circling back to the man in her salon. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was connected to all of this. She decided to reach out to her employees, asking if any of them remembered him. One of her stylists, Tasha, did. "Yeah, I remember that guy," Tasha said over the phone. "He came in a couple of times, always just sitting there. I thought he was waiting for someone, but no one ever showed up." "Why? What's going on, Keisha?" Keisha hesitated, not wanting to drag Tasha into this mess. "It's nothing." She lied, "Just curious." But as she hung up, she felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't just a random stranger. He was watching her, and now she was starting to wonder if he'd been watching her for a long time. Marcus, meanwhile, had hit a wall. Every lead he followed seemed to dead end. The officers involved in Keisha's arrest were tight-lipped, and the department wasn't exactly eager to cooperate with a CIA chief poking around in their business. But then, he got a break. An old contact from his days in the military reached out saying he had information that might be useful. They met in a secluded park, the kind of place where no one would overhear their conversation. "You're playing with fire, Marcus," the man said, his voice low. "This goes deeper than you think. Those cops, they're just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole network involved, people in high places, and they don't like it when someone starts asking questions." Marcus's heart raced. What kind of network? The man hesitated, glancing around nervously. "I don't know all the details, but I've heard rumors. They call it the Circle. It's some kind of underground group. Cops, politicians, maybe even feds. They protect each other, cover each other's tracks, and if you cross them—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Marcus thanked him and left, his mind reeling. If this was true, then Keisha's case wasn't just about a few rogue cops. It was about a system designed to keep people like her silent. Back at his office, Marcus shared what he'd learned with Keisha. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You're saying this is some kind of conspiracy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded grimly. "It looks that way. And if we're going to take them down, we need proof. Solid proof. Otherwise, they'll just bury us." Keisha swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about exposing something much darker, something that could destroy lives, including theirs. The next morning, they decided to visit the one person who might have answers, a former cop named Ray Jenkins. Ray had been forced into early retirement after he tried to blow the whistle on corruption within the department. He'd been labeled a troublemaker, a liar, and his career had been ruined. But Marcus had a feeling he might still have information that could help them. They found Ray living in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. He was hesitant to talk at first, but when Marcus explained why they were there, his demeanor changed. "You're messing with the wrong people," Ray warned. "But if you're serious about taking them down, I'll tell you what I know." What Ray revealed was chilling. He confirmed the existence of the Circle, describing it as a shadowy group that operated with near impunity. They had connections everywhere, City Hall, the courts, even the media. And their methods were ruthless. Anyone who threatened their power had a way of disappearing, or worse. Ray had tried to expose them once, and it had cost him everything. "They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "And if they think you're a threat, they won't stop until you're out of the picture." As Marcus and Keisha left Ray's apartment, they were both silent, the weight of his words hanging over them. They were up against something far bigger than they'd imagined, and the stakes had never been higher. But giving up wasn't an option. Not for Keisha, who was fighting for her freedom, and not for Marcus, who had made it his life's mission to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. That night, as they sat in Marcus's office poring over every piece of information they had, Keisha suddenly froze. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling. What if this isn't just about me? What if they're using me to send a message? To scare other people into staying silent?" Marcus looked at her, his expression grim. "You might be right," he said. "And if that's the case, then we're not just fighting for you. We're fighting for everyone they've ever silenced." But as they prepared to take their next step, a chilling realization hit them. They weren't the only ones digging. Someone else was watching, waiting, and they were closer than ever. The question was, who would make the next move? And what would it cost them? The clock was ticking and the shadows were closing in. But one thing was certain. This was far from over.